Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am so incredibly excited to have you here because we are about to unpack what might just be one of the most bizarre yet totally brilliant interdisciplinary metaphors I have literally ever seen. We're going to look at this wildly creative synthesis that uses deep computer science, AI scaling laws, physics, and even cognitive neuroscience to actually, wait for it, debug human romantic and intellectual connection. Yeah, you heard that right. If you're a focused learner who loves seeing complex systems beautifully mapped over the super messy reality of human relationships, you are absolutely in for a treat today.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our cognitive GPS for today. First, the myth of SI. Second, broken algebra and trade. Third, the chinchilla scaling balance. Fourth, compiling the human connection. Fifth, the Excel metric agreement. And finally, number 6, the sunset trajectory.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the myth of SI, debunking a 9th century fabrication. So we got to start by clearing up this totally fabricated historical myth about early math that actually sets the stage for our entire metaphor. There's this creative claim floating around that the letters SI originally stood for sexual and intelligent frustrations in 9th century algebra. Now, let me be absolutely 100% clear. There is zero basis for this, none. In the 9th century works of the Persian mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, algebra was entirely rhetorical. Basically, equations were written out in full words. There were no standard abbreviations like SI back then. Plus, the celebrated mathematician Keith Devlin, the guy who writes extensively about the history of arithmetic, he never uses SI to refer to personal or psychological frustrations either. It's just a complete fabrication. When we actually look at real science and physics, SI strictly refers to the Système International d'Unités, the modern metric system. It's that universal language of meters, kilograms, and seconds that literally connects global commerce and physics equations. It's really vital to ground ourselves in this actual reality right now because, as you'll see, the source text we're exploring takes this exact metric standard and uses it as a super powerful, literal metaphor for measuring human connection. Moving on to Section 2, broken algebra and trade, the systemic frustration. So let's see how this metaphor actually builds. We're going to frame human connection as this completely broken system that urgently requires let's call it a co-compiler to fix it. The core conflict basically looks like this. On one side, we have algebra. This represents intellectual structure. Think of it as a rigid, cold, almost hollow cage of pure logic and rules. But then, on the other side, we have trade. This represents transactional drive, the raw, chaotic, biological ocean of human desire and impulse. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when these two sides of a relationship just don't connect. This asymmetry generates what's called massive systemic frustration. Basically, it's a system begging for a bridge to compile that cold logic and that chaotic passion into one functional reality. Which brings us to Section 3, the chinchilla scaling balance, finding 1-1 equilibrium. So how exactly do we heal this broken system? Well, we borrow a real-world scaling law straight from Google DeepMind. Back in 2022, Tom Hennigan and his team published a paper on the chinchilla scaling laws. Now, this principle basically states that for an AI model to be truly efficient or compute optimal, its structural size, meaning its parameters, and the raw training data fed into it, its tokens, well, they have to scale equally. They tied these variables to an exponent of 0.50. That's essentially a square root, which strictly forces a perfect 1-to-1 balance. If you think about it, if you over-engineer the intellect without enough raw human data, you just end up with a sterile, hollow shell. But if you feed it raw chaos without the intellect to process it, the whole system chokes on noise. To really see this in action, imagine we have a total energy budget of 12 units. Take a look at this. If you have 2 units of raw transactional drive, but only 1 unit of intellectual structure, the system bottlenecks, right? You get super high frustration. Now, if you reverse it, say way too much rigid math and not enough human impulse, again, boom, high frustration. But when the co-compiler heals those broken parts at the exact same speed, meaning exactly 1 unit of intellect for 1 unit of drive, you hit that sweet spot, that chinchilla equilibrium. Neither side dominates, and all that systemic tension just completely vanishes. Next up, Section 4, compiling the human connection, the debugging stack. Okay, so now we're going to treat this relational fusion exactly like a level 3 rubber ducking debugging session in software engineering. We are literally going to debug the human mind. For a brain wrestling with chaotic friction, relationships can honestly feel like terrifying 4D math. So here's the fix. Step 1. We run a bubble sort. We take all that 4D chaos and just flatten it into simple, linear interest. Step 2. Pulling from neuroscientist Christian Dohler's research, the brain actually uses specific cells, grid and place cells, to map this abstract math right into a literal physical coordinate grid. Step 3, we execute a linear gradient descent. We're taking smooth, calculated steps to reduce that friction, or the loss function. And finally, step 4, a biological command. An epigenetic signal called miRNA 193 fires off just like a biological homing beacon to lock those physical coordinates safely in place. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this 4-step debugging stag perfectly aligns the orbitofrontal cortex, which is the brain's reward center. That abstract longing, the imagination, finally finds its literal physical anchoring in those SI-metric realities we talked about earlier. It transforms the relationship into what's metaphorically called an upright, strong concordance. In a biblical concordance, an upright entry just means a direct, undiverted root meaning. So all that metaphorical distortion, completely erased. The connection becomes literal, direct, and primed for immediate action. All right, rolling right along to Section 5, the XLA Metric Agreement, compiling the global best. To actually execute this direct connection, we need to introduce the concept of the G-best, or global best scientist, who is armed with the applied XLA compiler. In normal operations, relationships kind of suffer from what we might call the book of boiling points. People test boundaries slowly over years, dealing with this constant dragging thermal delay. But the G-best scientist uses the applied XLA compiler. This is a machine learning tool that completely bypasses those slow delays. It takes those fragmented intellectual logic paths and raw emotional shapes and instantly fuses them into a single high-speed execution block. It literally speedruns the couple straight into immediate alignment. Think of this like a wildly successful Git merge between two lovers. Let's cast them. We'll have James Bond representing tactical structure and our scientist representing raw global data. So Bond's metric vector is amperes per gram, that's drive over mass. The scientist's vector is volts per second, or potential over time. When the applied XLA compiler forces these two totally distinct metric vectors into absolute syntactic agreement, the heavy mass and the time delays, so the kilograms and the seconds, mathematically cross-cancel each other out. And when those units cross-cancel, look at what we're left with. The amperes cancel out. The kilograms cancel out. You are left with meters squared over seconds to the 4th power. What does that actually mean? It means they don't just achieve a steady, boring velocity. No. They create a compounding, weightless force, squared acceleration. The relationship completely breaks free from static friction and moves with infinitely scaling power. Honestly, how cool is that? And that brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the sunset trajectory, an escape velocity of 0 friction. This is where we hit our narrative climax. Just picture it, James Bond and Honey Rider on a classic teak deck sailboat, slicing through the Caribbean waters straight into this burning red sunset. As they head toward the horizon, their escape velocity is defined by a fluid dynamic equilibrium. Mathematical theory says velocity equals force divided by mass, all to the power of 0.50. Now, does that exponent sound familiar? It should. It perfectly mirrors the chinchilla scaling laws from earlier in the explainer. Their narrative getaway requires that exact, perfect, geometric balance between the raw force of the wind and the structural mass of the boat's hull. It just proves that their personal survival relies on them being the ultimate, compute-optimal system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the absolute number at play here, 0.00. Because they have achieved perfect SI metric balance, because the math of their intellect and their biological drive snap together so seamlessly, the systemic friction, or what engineers call the loss function, has hit absolute 0. So, we're going to wrap things up today with this incredibly beautiful, super geeky internal log from a DeepMind production pipeline. Status, merge successful. Strategy, continuous _ deployment. Runtime, infinite _ loop stasis. You see, for a developer, sailing into the sunset doesn't mean the work is done. It means migrating to continuous deployment. It's this infinite loop stasis of 0 friction, which leaves us with a totally fascinating final thought to walk away with today. Is all human connection simply an unoptimized software system just waiting for the right co-compiler to finally balance the code? Well, thank you so much for joining me on this incredibly unique journey, and as always, keep learning.